Hey there, today we're going to go over a little bit of payroll taxes and the reality that, as a little kid we think, okay, we go out, we work hard, we earn a bunch of money, and we'll be good to go. But at some point in our growing up, and maybe for some kids in high school, it hasn't even hit this point yet, but at some point we realize we don't get what we earn. We go out there, we work hard, and we earn $1,000, and next thing we know, the paycheck shows up and it's $700. And so, as an employer, that's a harsh reality. As an employee, that's a harsh reality. As an employer, what a lot of people don't realize is that employers also pay taxes on not just their own earnings as a company, but on their employees' earnings. So that's what we're going to go over today and take a look at those different things that happen when an employee earns money. So we got Uncle Sam watching over us working, and Uncle Sam is going to try to get as much of that dollar for every dollar that we earn as he can. And so time goes on and we earn a full dollar, but we only end up getting a fraction of that dollar. So looking at Uncle Sam growing an extra hand here to make it easier to grab more of that dollar, we see that there's really kind of two areas where the dollar is taxed and the government gets pieces of those earnings that an employee earns and that an employer pays the employee for earning that. Starting out on the employee's side, an employee earns $1, and the earnings is a gross amount, right? That's the full amount that's earned. What the employer owes is also calculated on that gross amount. So that $1 stays as a whole dollar for every tax that's applied to it. The employee has a few mandatory taxes that are going to be taken out of the paycheck and then physically paid for by the employer, but with the employee's money. So that's just kind of a service that the employer is doing, but it's actually still the employee's money. That's federal income tax, state income tax, and our FICA, or Medicare and Social Security. There's also some withholdings that are going to happen on a voluntary basis. That sounds kind of silly. Why would an employee volunteer to have money withheld from their paycheck? But it's going to go to things that provide them services like health insurance, maybe taken care of straight through the company, and so that's going to be withheld. Investments, retirement planning, like a 401k type of thing, may be taken care of straight through the company. That'll be just withheld straight out of the paycheck. So you've got the mandatory area, which is our taxes, and then we've got voluntary things that we may or may not see taken out of each employee's paycheck along the way. On the employer side, and remember this is also calculated on the gross earnings amount, on the employer side we have federal unemployment taxes, state unemployment taxes, and then again FICA, so Medicare and Social Security. So in a sense, the same dollar is being taxed by FICA twice. 1.45 for Medicare on the employee side, and then another 1.45% for Medicare on the employer side. And then with Social Security, 6.2% of that dollar on the employee side, and then another 6.2% on that dollar on the employer side. So when you look at Social Security taxes being applied, we see that 6.2% number, but in reality the government's collecting 12.4% because they're getting half of that 12.4, 6.2, from the employee and half of it from the employer. But it's all coming off that same $1 of gross earnings. Looking or zooming into the employee specifically, remember that it's all calculated on the gross earnings. So the federal income tax, the state income tax, and the FICA are the mandatory piece, and then the voluntary stuff is going to vary from employee to employee and what they choose to set up. The key with this here is that all of the mandatory and the voluntary stuff is withheld from the employee's gross earnings. This is something where the costs of So when we talk about these costs here, both the mandatory and the voluntary costs, those are coming out of the employee's earnings. The gross earnings amount is what is the cost to the employer. And we'll see that illustrated in a little bit. But these taxes and these voluntary deductions are not a cost to the employer. The cost to the employer is the gross amount, or that one full dollar being earned. Okay? Then on the employer side, on top of the gross pay costs that we just looked at for the employer, there are, again, calculated on the gross earnings amount, there are these 4 tax categories. This one here represents 2, so that's where we get the 4. There are the 4 tax categories that are based on this gross earnings dollar that the employer is responsible for paying. And that is a cost on top of the gross pay costs that we incur just from our employees earning what they earn. And these are all paid for by the employer on top of the gross earnings that the employer is paying for. Okay? Let's look at a couple illustrations in terms of how this looks. Let's say that our gross earnings in the example, and don't worry about what kind of time period it is, if it's a week or a month or bi-weekly or whatever it is. The gross earnings in this case, this scenario, is $100. So here's our beautiful $100 bill. That's what was earned. And we're going to look at the employee side of it first. The employee is going to be earning $100. And so that's the expense to the company. Right? Remember, the gross earnings amount is the expense or the cost to the company. So we're increasing costs related to salaries by $100. And then as a company, we're holding on to all of these things, or withholding from the paycheck all of these things to be passed on to the respective agencies. So for federal income tax, we're holding on to 20%. So 20% on $100 is this $20 amount here. And then you can just go right down the line. State income tax is 4%. So here's your 4% state income tax on the $100. That comes out very nicely to $4. You're welcome for me making this problem, the $100 gross earnings amount. I actually did it for me, so the calculations were easy for me to do. But you see along the lines here, these are all payables except for this last one. This is how much the check is actually written to the employee for. They earned $100. We're holding $20 for federal taxes. We're holding $4 for state taxes. We're holding $1.45 for Medicare. We're holding on to $6.20 for Social Security. We're holding on to $10 to pass on to the health insurance company. And we're holding on to $5 to pass on to the investment company for the 401k. So what's left is what the employee actually gets in their paycheck, and that's the $53.50. Moving over to the employer's side, we see the 4 taxes, right? And the amounts are just simply going to be law, and these are going to change from year to year. Sometimes they get adjusted and tweaked and whatever. So say 6% for FUTA. Here's that. That's going to end up in the FUTA tax payable. That's eventually going to go on and get paid. But as of now, it's a payable, it's a liability. 8%, so there's your $8 for SUTA payable. And then you see this Medicare show up again and the Social Security show up again because it's taxed twice on the same gross earnings, or that same $100 there. This time it's being paid for by the employer. And in the end, as a result of these 4 taxes, here's the payroll tax expense. All four of these added up. And so in this case, the employer is incurring $21.65 for payroll tax expense. So for this employee's pay period, the total amount that the employer is incurring in costs is $100 worth of gross pay and $21.65 worth of the payroll taxes. So this employee thinks they're only costing the company $100, or maybe they think they're only costing the company $53.35 because that's all they're getting in their paycheck. But in reality, this employee, just due to the paycheck itself, is costing the company $121.65. Hope that makes sense. Hope it's clear. Hope you don't have too many questions on it.